Podcasting from the beautiful state of Maine, welcome to another episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast, the show that focuses on identifying and developing the skills and behaviors that will inspire, empower, and compel others to follow your lead. Listen as Patrick's guests talk about the powerful leadership approaches they have identified and developed, which are vital for leading in today's challenging times. These are the same approaches that will positively impact you as a leader too. Learning from Leaders provides the right balance of leadership research with real-world scenarios, making it easy for you to rise above your best. All right, let's start the show.
Hey everybody, I'm Patrick Verano, the host of this podcast, Learning from Leaders, as well as the author of the best-selling book, The Leadership Rich: How to Engage Your Employees and Drive Organizational Excellence. And on today's episode, my guest is Andrew Rahaman, and he is the co-founder of a company called bluSPARC. And their approach to organizational development and coaching, I think, is so valuable. It really bases all of its focus around science, around the research, but also applying it in the real world, both in terms of the assessments, the approach, and the type of coaching they do, both individual and group, and how that impacts their result and the outcomes they're able to provide for their clients. There's a lot of value in this episode, so let's get into it. Andrew, I want to thank you for being on the Learning from Leaders podcast. This is really all about leadership today, this conversation. You're an expert in this area, a co-founder of the company bluSPARC, and a unique approach to how you develop your leaders in regards to your program. So I want to go down that road, but just out of curiosity, I'd love to hear a little bit of background on how you came up with the name bluSPARC.
Thank you very much for having me on your show. I very much appreciate it. And I appreciate all the great podcasts that you put out there for your other leaders that are learning so much from you. So really, thank you very much for hosting me on it. So the name bluSPARC originated our understanding of what got people into organizations and where they are now at that director, senior director, VP level. They're probably pretty successful. They've been successful to get where they are. And like a flame, the hottest part of that flame burns blue. And for it to burn blue, sometimes even successful people need an additional spark to ignite that fuel that they already have. So bluSPARC represents that spark that brings out the best in people. What we really say about bluSPARC is we deliver evidence-based organizational performance. And how we do that is through evidence-based coaching, evidence-based collaborative learning, and evidence-based assessments. So that's how we came up with the name bluSPARC. And in a nutshell, that's how we think about what we do in organizations, the rising tide that lifts all boats.
I love that. And I will tell you the whole idea behind the evidence-based component of this. My background prior to going into leadership development and consulting was in the biotech industry. And everything that we did was around research. If you were meeting with thought leaders or other practitioners, you had to go with evidence, with a study or something that would demonstrate why they should follow what you're asking them to do. And I think leadership is very much the same way. We don't spend enough time in that space of saying there's so much research out there in regards to how people make decisions, what's effective leadership look like, that if we tapped into that, to me, it's evidence-based leadership.
Absolutely. And even thinking about the complexities of our work environment over the last 3 years, COVID, let's put that into a general kind of framework. When asked, pick a metaphor that represents an organization. Most people go with something that looks like the gears on a wheel, on a watch. Well, that kind of machine model has given way to the evidence that organizations are really open systems. They're more like organisms. And as a result of that, we have to bring that evidence-based adult learning theory, assessments, coaching that helps the organization adapt to its environment, helps the person grow and learn new skills. What we may have learned in principle, maybe back in the 80s or 90s or the 70s, whatever era one is from, but certainly the last couple of years have proven to us that, hey, there are leadership skills that are much more nuanced now based on the social constructs that are happening that require us to come to the table with evidence.
Yeah. Along those lines, is there any observation that you have seen over the last 2 years, as I would say, There's BC now, which is before COVID and after COVID.
Yeah. So I think some of the observations that I've seen over the last couple of years is that people were often promoted into leadership positions or management positions. Let's even say that. And they relied upon I see this person, it's here with us. But COVID changed the way we work, the way we think about work, and the way we should be leading at work. It's really forced us to consider what our assumptions are about leadership and about ourselves and how we interact with other people. And what I mean by that, Patrick, is there's a whole new world of intentionality about bringing leadership to other people. When we think about leadership, it's the ability to influence people towards a common goal in its simplest way, right? But in a remote environment, bringing that sense of influence requires really connecting with people at a personal level, creating belonging in an organization, being much more thoughtful about how you have conversations about performance.
Which is interesting. And I know that was one of the things that I'd mentioned to you before this, of saying that one of the things that I continue to hear is the struggle that leaders have in a remote setting, how to lead in a remote environment. How do you address that?
Yeah, so certainly remote work has a lot of great environments, the diversity of people you can hire from all over the country, if not internationally, certainly employee morale, certainly saving commuting time. And it also brings with this those that are in management positions and in leadership positions, thinking about how do I still get performance from them? So some time ago, Warren Bennis, who we would often think of as the father of leadership, made this statement. He wrote this article, Crisis That Shapes the Leader. And what he meant by that, in my mind, was that the experiences create meaning by causing us to self-reflect on our own assumptions around how we lead. So as when we think about these leaders now in remote environments, hybrid environments, virtual environments, I think there are a couple of common issues that come up. One is around how do I communicate effectively? Not just what do I say, but how do I communicate? How do I create team synergy when people aren't there? As we create interactions with people, we get meaning from those. The third one is how do I create a sense of cohesion? As we know from the constructs, cohesion leads to motivation. Motivation oftentimes leads to discretionary effort and performance. And then how do I build resilience? And then finally, how do I get performance? Like, how do I have those conversations about goal setting, objective, and feedback? I think those are 5, and I think there's a 6th one, if not a lot more, around culture. How do I create the culture? But those, I think, are really top 5, communication, strategy.
And it's interesting. I think the one that I hear the most right now is around culture, right? If we've now gone to a hybrid environment, how do you create a culture? What is that going to look like? And quite honestly, my guess is there are probably some individuals that went remote that are happy that they don't have to be in that culture anymore.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. But when we think about then what is culture, isn't it that embedded, normalized behavior over time that leads us to thrive or simply survive in an organization? And the things that create culture then are words and our actions. At the end of the day, it's normalized behavior. And so what are those words that we're using? And what are those actions? I had said to you, I think one of the really important things about as leaders and managers have transitioned is communication ranks top. I've asked, Patrick, hundreds of people, what are the leadership skills needed now and into the future? And that word communication comes up quite often. But as we start to pull on that thread of communication, what are they really talking about?
Yeah.
We're not talking about those hallway conversations. We're not talking about popping into someone's office. They are. They're also talking about creating organizational or corporate conversation, and conversations are where 2 or more people are engaged in it, not just the one-way communication from a remote environment. When we first started, organizations were sending out, this is what's happening, this is what's happening. Where was the 2-way conversation that was taking place?
Yeah. What would your thoughts be around spontaneity as well, in terms of a brick and mortar environment where the water cooler, I think, has much more value to it today, in that spontaneity where you're not having to schedule every call because we're in different locations. You just bumped into somebody and
you're absolutely right. Walking down the hall, popping your head into somebody else's office, and now it seems like we've got to schedule everything. Well, I think part of that scheduling is almost like what we saw at the office. If my door is slightly closed and I only have it 6 inches, that really means I'm working. Please don't really come in unless you knock first, right? So I think part of that exists for us on Zoom, which is certainly leaders that I know and I'm working with, they would have open office kind of or open Zoom moments where they may have their Zoom just open like the way we have ours right now, Patrick. You and I are talking, but they're working on their own things. So people can drop in with them at that time. So I do see the loss of that. And I also see ways that people are mitigating that. Clearly, one where in the hybrid organization where people are going back to the office a couple of days a week, being really intentional what days people are going back and why they're going back. If they're going back to sit in their office to work by themselves, that kind of defeats the purpose then of that open conversation, that collaboration. Yeah, so that conversation, though, I think is the impromptu. Now it has to be a little bit more intentional, that communication. So turning it into a conversation where there's consideration of how people relate to one another. Conducting that meaningful conversation really requires that attitudinal distance is shortened. So it can't just be boss to direct report versus I'm engaging you because I'm interested in what you have to say. It's also around multi-directional. It's got to be lateral as much as it does need to be top down, bottom up from it too. I think that becomes important for it. I think creating the sense of affiliation between people in those conversations, where those conversations are around, we're co-creating something together, allowing and providing the structure and the process for the conversation to start from the bottom and rise up, I think really becomes important too. Because that starts to really help people become more able to cope with changes because they give feedback, able to tap into collective intelligence, results in certainly problem solving and creative action. And then I think those clarifying conversations mean, what is our vision? What are the company goals? How do I fit into these goals? Those are all part of the conversation. And I think when we went to COVID or during that period of time, and as we've come out of it, it was this sense of we need all these people working in our organization, and how do they all help us meet our stated vision or our goal and our goals for the company? I think those were really important conversations, certainly with companies that we at bluSPARC work with.
Yeah. When I hear you talking about the different levels of communication and directionally how we do that, I think of a model by David Rock, SCARF, which talks about status, right? People's feeling of worth and importance and where do they fit. And then certainty, you talk about what is this going to look like? And then autonomy in that in terms of people having a say in what is this going to look like going forward. And then the R in that is around relatedness, right? We talk about the belongingness. And I would guess we could even put fairness in there too, in that SCARF model, in terms of probably people wondering, how is this going to look? How will I be treated?
Yeah. So any conversation, and you know this, that they say that trust is the foundation of all relationships. Well, certainly psychological safety in communication and conversation has got to be the mortar.
Yeah. Which is interesting, right? We hear so much about psychological safety now. And I think those that hear it for the first time might think, oh, here we go. This is some type of snowflake and kumbaya. And it's the opposite. It's vitally important for an organization to have that ability where people feel as though, I look at it as you can be yourself without violating other people. You get to be yourself. You're
right there, Patrick, about being yourself. And then your analogy is it's something that's kind of here in flavor, fat of the month. Think about any relationship that you have, whether it's work-related or personal relationships. If you don't feel, you don't believe, and your belief leads to a feeling, and your feelings lead to beliefs. You don't feel or believe that, look, I have a place to speak up and not be in jeopardy around my self-esteem, around certainty. Am I even going to speak up? Now let's put ourselves in, we're in a hybrid environment or a remote environment, and we may feel further and further away. I mean, what's the number one thing about remote workers, right? A sense of loneliness. Further and further away. How do I engage my boss, my peers, if I don't feel like I'm part of the conversation. I don't believe I'm part of the conversation. So that David Rock's model, SCARF, and others that around psychological safety, Amy Edmondson talks a lot about it too.
Yeah.
That's a pivotal part about building trust. My colleague had said words create worlds, and how they're spoken really starts to set the stage.
It really is so true. And I do think some of those models, SCARF or psychological safety, I think was first identified or researched back in the 60s, I believe, in terms of that concept, or maybe the 70s. But here we are. We certainly hear much more of it now, but it's just vitally important, I think, in terms of where we go and how we lead.
Yeah. So one of the questions you had asked was, what are you hearing in terms of like what's changed, or to paraphrase you, with the remote working? Sure. The nuance of being able to have those conversations that have psychological safety embedded in them. And as a leader, a manager, peer, showing up in a way that people feel this way, then helps them to develop that sense of cohesion. And this is, I think, something that really also is important as in the hybrid remote work environment, is humans by nature are social, emotional creatures. We thrive on this sense of positive relationships. We're wired to move towards something that we feel safe and really kind of good about, and move away from those things that we might have that threat to.
Totally.
The amygdala hijack, duck and cover, run, fight. So I think in that sense of using psychological safety, it's the communication, but it's also around how we help bring people together to create this sense of cohesion when we do it. On-site environments, they're rich with opportunities to pass, to get in, to get out, to connect with people. All of a sudden, this accelerated speed to which everyone went to remote work left this cohesion and this sense of, well, how do I connect with my peers and my bosses? And now I'm in virtual. How do I still connect with them besides this pre-programmed Monday morning, 9:00, once a week staff meeting, right? So building cohesion in one way is building trust. I think one of the things that many remote workers feel is this sense of loneliness. And loneliness is a sense of connection. And we can think of loneliness as, yes, it's an emotional response to a lack of connection. So can we start to create structures that allow people the opportunities, the process to be in contact with one another, to have these conversations, to get to know one another? So that challenge then becomes creating a workplace that has a structure that creates social interaction, processes that create. And we just leave our Zoom on. And if people want to drop in to see us, they just drop in while we're working, or put in, I'm busy, or I'm available at certain times.
You mentioned something that I thought a lot about around us being, we're really like pack animals, that we need that sense of connection, is that we were all displaced in some regard. And even if you're an introvert, I do believe that you choose to be an introvert. This was sort of forced on you into introversion. And I think that has impacted a lot of individuals where isolation is not good for us. We do not do well with isolation. And I think we are seeing some of the behaviors as a result of that isolation. In terms of how we treat each other, there's a one-dimensional level for me right now when we're on a Zoom. Whereas when we're in person, there's texture to you. You might say something online that now becomes who you are. Where if we're in person, I see other aspects of you. You're not a one-dimensional person for me.
Right. Body language, context. When you have 15 people on Zoom and one person is talking, you're really kind of focused on that one person. You don't see anybody else. And then, of course, there's some, well, why do I have to put my camera on? Well, you're at work. You wouldn't hold up a piece of paper and not let people see you, so we can read your body language, your smile, your frown, the quizzical look. Mind you, some people like, yeah, really, please don't read my body language. But others, for the main part, that's a really important cue to, I'm noticing something. Let's explore that.
You mentioned in regards to onboarding, and I thought about that when I saw your comments on that. I have a son who's 24 years old. His job out of college was onboarded through his apartment. He never got to go into the organization. He was onboarded, and it was terrible for him. Talk about loneliness, and he's a social individual.
Sure.
And he spent a year and a half working from his apartment for this organization.
Yeah.
I know you talked about the importance right now, I think, of really doubling down on onboarding as part of this great resignation. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you for asking. It's a topic that I feel really candidly very passionate about. And I make the distinction, though, Patrick, between onboarding, which we often refer to as an HR function of you're coming to the organization. Congratulations, you're here. We have a ream of paper for you to fill out, but we really like you. Here's your computer. Your office is, by your kitchen table. So tongue in cheek, the onboarding is often thought about really just the functional part of HR of bringing somebody and getting them settled into the door. When bluSPARC refers to onboarding, we're actually speaking about acculturation. We're actually speaking around reducing the time it takes to bring someone recently hired to effectiveness. And you think, well, okay, effectiveness, I've given them their computer, they know how to plug in. No, effectiveness then is really around getting them connected to people inside the organization. Like, think about it. Gallup, a great organization, does a lot of research and creates articles that are research-based. And they said that 12% of employees if the company does a good job of onboarding. Well, that leaves another 88% out there that don't do such a good job.
Yeah.
But what's the cost of replacing someone that leaves? And most people will make that decision in the first 6 months, if not less. And as the higher you go up into the organization, what's the cost of replacing an executive? 2 or 3 times their salary, perhaps the search fee, not to mention the lack or the inability to really capitalize on that person's skill sets around strategic development and implementation. So when I think of onboarding, I think about it then really in the sense of creating meaningful connections at the workplace who are important to that person's role. Creating role clarity. A new executive joins, ask 10 people, what's this person's true role? I'm now speaking from experience. You'd be surprised at the different answers one gets based on the perspective of where that person answering is coming from. Marketing may answer it one way, supply chain may answer it another, the CFO may answer it another way, the board of directors may answer it another. So I think onboarding process is creating meaningful connection, creating role clarity, developing a deep understanding or an understanding of the culture of the organization, the do's, the don'ts, the culture that's needed now to go further. It certainly, we know, increases employee engagement because now you've involved others in this person's onboarding, so they've become willing participants to make sure that that person is successful. And I mean, I think that the benefits are huge with that around costs alone.
Yeah, I think about that. I jokingly did a short LinkedIn Live on this, and I called it basically employer catfishing. I remember seeing not that long ago, there was a dating app, and the woman shows up and looks at the guy and looks at his profile, and he's about 20 years older sitting at the table than he is in the profile. And I think that's how many people probably feel in organizations when they're unhappy of this. You sold me something that now that I'm here, this is nothing like what you said it was going to be when you hired me, right? There's a lack of alignment between expectations and reality.
And you get that alignment by getting the perspectives of people that work in the organization. And then something we have done very, very successfully is to onboard CEOs or C-suite is we've actually conducted interviews with people in the organization around issues around role clarity. Who should the person know? What's the culture? Describe the culture. And thinking things like when this person comes on board, what do you think some of the goals are for this person right away? Gosh, there's a huge win all of a sudden. This person is presented with this information from these interviews that we have themed, and then we create this forum where this person meets their peers and some of their direct reports in this forum. These were the results. They really have an opportunity to talk about it. Patrick, all of a sudden, we have people deeply invested in this person's success.
Yeah. Well, it's a whole different environment, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You talk about enterprise learning, and you mentioned that you see it as a cultural imperative right now in the marketplace.
I do. I think enterprise learning is very, very important because when you think about the quiet quitting, the great resignation, the low unemployment, the scrambling for organizations to look for people, learning is an impetus to change. When we learn, we change. And we think about how many people think about change and what do they want in an organization. It's very clear people want professional development. So continuous learning around professional development becomes really important to them. It's around intact team coaching. So bringing teams together that appear at one function, coaching them together, doing leadership development with them, enterprise-wide leadership team coaching, taking peers or colleagues at the same level from different functions around the organization. That generates collaborative inquiry, creative problem solving, solutions to problems from different perspectives, buy-in. So I really believe in enterprise learning, as I do in one-to-one coaching also.
When I hear you talk about that, which I love that concept, is that I would imagine it also impacts silos, where you have the breakdown of silos where I work a lot in healthcare right now, and resources can be difficult. If you're working with teams that are in different departments, different areas of the hospital, there seems to be a lot more effectiveness of now you know who that person is in purchasing or on the recovery floor or wherever else they are, so that when something is requested of somebody else, it's much easier to reach out to them to make an ask when you know who that person is.
Absolutely. You're doing so much with this enterprise learning. I think about it like in terms of the benefits of concurrent leadership. It's not one person solving a problem. The process of organizational collaborative learning reduces hierarchy. It creates networks with people. It creates the conditions for people to share information, share questions, reframe issues, problems or issues into solutions that have buy-in. It creates solutions that look like there's not one way, but there's actually multiple ways. And what do people really want when it comes to, why didn't you ask me? I had the answer. Well, wait, let's get everybody out there. It creates a sense of empathy, peer-to-peer, collaborative learning, enterprise-wide learning, builds partnerships as people start to feel safe to discuss goals, where they may be stumbling, perspective on what somebody is going through and their issues. It's certainly creating collective intelligence. We're now adding to that pool of knowledge where everyone now is like, I hadn't thought about it like that before. Let me ask some questions from my perspective and let's see how others react to that in the group. So yes, that's definitely one way to do it.
Yeah. Now, in connection with the team coaching, you also do one-on-one coaching as part of this process with them, which I think is a great combination. What's the benefit that you see?
So we often think about, in fact, we started off our conversation around evidence-based coaching, and I had used the phrase evidence-based assessments, collaborative learning. So this is an example, the continuous learning, and certainly the one-on-one coaching. We often start our coaching in service to the organization. And we think about it in the sense of, what is the organization trying to achieve? They have goals. And so those goals then start to come down, cascade down to that individual. So in a one-on-one coaching session, we start with an assessment at what competencies are important in your role now, and how do you think you're doing in them? Then, as we have the coaching session, we explore the person's attitudes, interpersonal skill sets, their functional competencies through the lens of these organizational competencies that are important to achieve goals. And those goals can also be not just dollars and cents. Those goals can be, we need to increase our ability of our managers to have larger networks. We need to increase our ability of our senior directors to have strategic alignment. And that's how we explore it. And that's where we get the benefit. That's where we see evidence-based at the end of our coaching engagements. And I hate to use the word end of our coaching engagement, but throughout the process, we take these pulse checks, not only with the leader we're coaching, it's also with their manager. Are you seeing any movement in these competencies? We create structure in our coaching so that the leader and the manager have a way to talk about, well, what's important in my role right now in terms of competencies to meet my goals.
Now, as part of this evidence-based approach, from a duration standpoint, how long before you start to see results and ones that are durable?
Yeah. So oftentimes our coaching, so you asked specifically about the one-on-one coaching. Well, oftentimes we combine our coaching, one, with assessments, and then we also combine it with peer-to-peer coaching.
Right.
So we use the one-on-one coaching as a way to help that person develop individual competencies, individual personal skills or functional skills in some way. Then we use the collaborative learning or the peer-to-peer, the group coaching, as a way to bring everybody into shared accountability. We know people learn best when they can all apply what they're learning to their current situation, their work, when they learn in context of the culture, when they learn and they get support from people that they work with. So I would say most of our coaching engagements go for 6 months or so, though we have many coaching engagements that go for less than that when we use the collaborative learning process in conjunction with that. And we do assessments after all of our coaching, or most of our coaching engagements, asking that person and their manager, whatever level we're talking about, at the C-suite too, have you noticed changes?
Yeah.
And so we collect that evidence. And so, yes, we do see that over time, and it depends on how we structure the coaching engagement with the peer-to-peer learning or involved in the collaborative or action learning.
Yeah, it would seem that approach, when you talk about 6 months or the combination, I immediately think of neuroplasticity, right? How are we building these circuits where this becomes not just a great short-term project that we did where everybody feels good for a while and then they lose those muscles that they've built, but this is really about building long-term connections. So I appreciate
Absolutely. And I think that's really important now in our hybrid or remote working as a way of helping people stay on top, getting to the next level. My personal phrase about coaching is we're opening the aperture for development. This is not about fixing what's wrong. This is getting you to the next level.
Yeah.
And you have a trajectory. So let's get you there and let's create the structure that starts to help you or the team act in ways, so your behavior, act in ways that get you to success and the organization to success.
Yeah. As I mentioned to you before this, I did go on. I'd been looking at your site in terms of the process that they go through. And there's a great flow to it of the individual choosing who they want to have as a coach through profiles and things like that. But then the assessments and then the group and then the follow-up support. I think it's on so many vital things that are really, it sets people up for success. So,
Patrick, you're referring to then the bluSPARC.com, how our approach works?
Yeah.
Okay, sure, absolutely. And so we started, and it's interesting, we keep coming back to this around the evidence-based coaching and evidence-based assessment, really the science of leadership in an era now of the need for adaptive change. But you're right, we let our leaders that we're working with pick a coach. They have to be able to establish that trust so that they come willing and able. We then start off with an assessment around 20 organizational competencies that we know are important for organizational effectiveness. Throughout the process, the engagement we have, we bring these leaders together in cohorts or in collaborative learning circles where they get to talk about an issue at work that they're all familiar with in a way, because they're all familiar with the context, most of the organizational goals. So we bring them together. And something that we particularly do that is important to us is we then circle back to the CHRO or to the CFO or the COO, whoever hired us, throughout the engagement process and talk about, with data, these are the competencies that people are talking about.
Yeah.
This is the learning content that we're giving your leaders in between the coaching session.
Yeah.
Then we round it out with being able to look at an assessment. What was the movement like over the coaching engagement, the collaborative learning?
To me, it's research overlapping with real world so that the two work well together.
Yeah, absolutely. When we think about what bluSPARC does, yes, we use coaching, we use leadership development, but those are our tools to really get to something else, which is helping that person who's spending 8 to 10 hours of their day, most likely 10, trying to achieve organizational performance. So what we do is really around organizational performance, is really around succession pipeline, is really around helping that person get to the next level. And the tools we use are rooted in that science of leadership, evidence-based learning, evidence-based.
Yeah. Andrew, thank you so much. This conversation really has been so valuable. I always appreciate hearing different perspectives on how other organizations and experts are dealing with a lot of the challenges of leaders today or what's facing them. If somebody's listening and wants to get a hold of you, what's the best way to do that?
Sure. Go on to bluSPARC.com. There's a contact us. You can certainly reach us through that. And of course, LinkedIn. We have a bluSPARC LinkedIn page. Certainly send us a message that way and somebody will reach right back out to you. Patrick, thank you very much for inviting me on your show. And thank you for the great work that you're doing in having these podcasts and contributing to the pool of meaning from leaders speaking to other leaders. Very much appreciate it.
Great. Thanks. Wishing you the best.
All right. Thank you very much, Patrick.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my podcast. If you found the guests and topics on my show and my perspectives on the show to be valuable to your own personal growth or to the growth of your team, I would love the opportunity to have a discussion with you on how the models, the approaches, and the book that I've published, The Leadership Bridge, How to Engage Your Employees and Drive Organizational Excellence, can help you and your organization as well. If you're interested, you can reach out to me at patrick@emeryleadershipgroup.com, and that's EMERY leadershipgroup.com. And let's explore how my unique models and approaches can help you and your team or your organization to rise above your best.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast listening platform. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time, keep rising above your best as a leader.